Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2 version 3, the draft version of the standard. Give everyone one more minute to join us before we go ahead and get started. But we will be discussing a very preliminary review of the changes to this standard based on the draft version, which was published a couple months ago. And I will throw the disclaimer out here that this is a very early review. Obviously, it's still the draft version. The final version of the standard hasn't been published yet, and any of this information is subject to change. We haven't gone through any formal training to the revised standard or anything like that. So as time goes on and we learn more about the new standard, we will continue to update and offer this webinar with updated information. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. We have an agenda outlined on the first screen here. We'll talk a little bit about PJR as a registrar and certification body. We'll talk at a high level about the benefits of certification. We will go through the tentative transition information as has been released so far. And then we'll look at the revisions to the standard, the draft version that's been released, some of the key changes, related document revisions, things like that. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the certification process for anyone who would be having their organization certified for the first time rather than transitioning from R2 2013 to R2 version 3. We'll talk about what that certification process looks like in general, and we'll close with any questions. So feel free to type any questions you may have in the questions field, and we will save those for the end. Just really quickly about PJR, we're one of the leading registrars in the world. This list is not all-inclusive, but it gives you an idea of the range of countries to which we have certified organizations so far. And we are accredited to grant certification also for a wide variety of standards. Obviously, today we're talking about R2. Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar with the certification benefits, we'll cover those very quickly. R2 obviously being an electronics recycling and reuse standard, one of the benefits of certification would be demonstrating that commitment to responsible recycling and reuse of electronics and the various components from an environmental and health and safety standpoint, that commitment to responsibly managing the reuse and disposal, recycling those components as much as possible, trying to protect workers from potential exposures to the heavy metals and other hazardous materials in electronics, as well as keep our earth as green as possible. Another benefit to certification to R2 would be improvements to the organization's EHS performance, which EHS refers to environmental health and safety. You'll see that acronym quite frequently throughout the presentation. This standard provides a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements, as many management system standards do. Obtaining certification drives an improvement or an increase in management commitment as well as employee engagement. Certifications such as R2 can provide a competitive advantage and/or improve the organization's public image, being able to advertise that you maintain a standard certification like R2. There may be other potential financial benefits, not including those we just mentioned, through the competitive advantage. A framework for achieving strategic objectives that the organization may have, as well as any stakeholder requirements. And also the ease of integration with other business management systems would be another benefit of certification. Okay, Again, I need to stress, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I need to stress the tentative nature of all of this information. The standard can change, the transition timeline can change, all of this stuff can change with the final version. So we're just working with the information we have so far to give everyone a general idea of where we stand. So the current status of the standard, the draft has been released, and I have a link here where the draft can be downloaded from CIRI's website. CIRI is currently in the phase of reviewing the public comments to the draft. So that's where it stands currently. The final version of R2v3 is expected to be published later this year. And again, that is tentative. After the final version of R2v3 is published, then we may get some type of update as far as when we can expect revised versions of the R2 Code of Practice and the R2 guidance document. Those have not been released at this time, nor a timeline released. Certification body auditors will be trained to the new standard once it's published to be able to audit to the new standard. And in conjunction with having our auditors trained, PJR and all other certification bodies will also need to go through the accreditation process to be able to issue accredited certificates. So we need to go through the process as a registrar to be approved to conduct audits to the standard, but primarily to be able to issue those accredited certificates. So sometimes it's possible to begin audits before we've achieved that, but we would not be able to issue any accredited certificates until we have gone through that accreditation process. So PJR will keep all our clients informed as to the status of all of those items, as well as a formal transition plan once the final version of the standard is published and CIRI formalizes its transition requirements. PJR will make that transition plan available to all impacted clients. Sometimes PJR will communicate an internal deadline ahead of the deadline that CIRI may set in order to prevent a lapse in certification. That remains to be seen. We will address that in the formal transition plan once we issue that. But if we do, that would be to ensure that there's enough time from when the audit takes place to when we actually issue the certificate to account for all of the activities that go into the certificate issuance. If there are any nonconformities, those need to be addressed and closed out with the auditor. The package needs to be internally reviewed, and then it needs to go through the certification decision-making activities like reviewing the scope and issuing sample certificates, having them approved by the client, etc. CIRI will also release information regarding training to R2v3 as that gets closer. As they have in the past, they will train certification body auditors, and they will offer training for internal auditors and consultants, so keep an eye out for that information to be released. The tentative timeline for transition released for R2v3 is as follows. For facilities who would be pursuing certification to R2 2013 for the first time, maybe they have already contracted or in the process of creating all their documentation to R2 2013 to be initially certified to go through that registration audit process. They will have 6 months from the release, the publication date of R2v3 to complete their stage 2 audit. After that deadline, after 6 months from release, no new registration audits can be conducted to R2 2013. So keep that in mind if you're trying to squeak under the deadline there. 6 months goes by quickly. Our auditors have busy schedules, so keep that in the back of your mind when you're planning. For facilities who are already certified to R2 2013, these next 2 bullet points apply to you. And your transition requirements depend on when you are due to recertify or when your certificate expires. So if you're already certified to R2 2013 and your certificate expires within 12 months of the publication of R2v3, you will be able to be recertified to R2 2013 one more time if you would like. Or if your certificate expires after 12 months of the release, you'll be required to upgrade to R2v3 at the next recertification audit, as long as the transition can be completed by the ultimate deadline, and we'll talk about that in a second. So it really depends on when your certificate is set to expire. And if you are allowed to be recertified to R2 2013 under that first bullet point, your expiration date will reflect the transition deadline of December 31st, 2022, if that is less than 3 years from when you recertify. So certificates are usually good for 3 years. If you recertify within the 12 months of the release of R2v3, but your certificate would then expire after that date, your certificate will be set to expire earlier than usual to reflect that transition deadline. So as I referenced earlier, the final deadline for transition is December 31st, 2022. That's for everyone. If you haven't transitioned by then and a certificate issued, there will be a lapse in certification. The reason that CIRI has made this decision to do the transitions based on the expiration dates is really to stagger the transitions so that not all the facilities are transitioning at the same time, which really overloads the certification bodies with a high volume of facilities trying to transition all at once. It also gives the R2 facilities at least a year to plan out their transition effectively. I put this information into a timeline in case that is easier to see in a visual representation. So based on the tentative deadline of the end of this year, having the R2v3 standard published, that would put us Q2 of 2020 for the deadline for new certifications or new registration audits to R2 2013 before that is no longer an option. Then the Q4 of 2020, whatever that 1 year mark is, if certificates are expiring after that, you can still upgrade when you choose. Otherwise, if they're expiring before that, you can upgrade. If you're expiring based on that 12-month deadline, you can still recertify one more time to R2 2013. Anything after that, any expiration dates after that, they'll need to upgrade at the next recertification audit for sure. And you can choose to upgrade sooner if you would like. It doesn't have to be at the recertification audit. We will, at this point, plan to train our auditors or have training from CIRI for our auditors at the end of this year to be able to hopefully start auditing to the new standard in the Q1 of 2020. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the final deadline is December 31st of 2022 for all certificates to transition to R2v3. All R2 2013 certificates would be obsolete on that date if they haven't already transitioned. Okay, these slides will be made available on PJR's website. That's a lot of information in case you want to go back and reference any of that information. The slides and a recording from today's webinar will be made available in the next day or so. Okay, so talk really briefly about why the standard was revised. CIRI has identified some of the reasons for revision, accounting for lessons learned on CIRI's part, on the part of the R2 Technical Advisory Committee, which is the TAC, or any feedback from the TAC, as well as feedback from public comments, including customers, auditors, certification bodies, etc. There is a wide variety of a wide range of diversity in this industry. So the standard was also revised to hopefully better account for that diversity and still have the standard be able to be applied to various organizations within the industry. Reinforcing effective implementation of standard requirements or to ensure that the intent of the standard is being achieved. That was one of the main drivers for revising R2 2013, as well as to clarify the language within the standard if anything was leading to confusion or, as I mentioned a second ago, causing some organizations to deviate from the intent of the standard. That has been clarified to try and address those items. And as with most standards, we can point to things such as continued market relevance, maintaining compatibility with other standards, ease of use, ease of translation, and flexibility for applying the standard to organizations of different sizes and sectors within the relevant industries. So we'll cover some of the key changes in the standard briefly, and future webinars hopefully will be able to elaborate on these subjects in more detail or delve more deeply into some of these topics as more information becomes available. I just want to mention one of the main takeaways of today's webinar should be that the original intent of the R2 standard has not changed at all. There is still the emphasis on reuse and recycling. We still have that hierarchy of responsible management strategies to make sure that the electronics and components are being managed responsibly, and that has not changed at all. The structure of the standard has changed, and I have a snapshot of the table of contents here on the screen. The standard has been divided into core requirements and process requirements. The majority of the requirements from the R2 2013 standard are still found within the core requirements, although you can see that the grouping and the order and the number of provisions in the core requirements section has changed from R2 2013. And then the process requirements, which are appendices in the second half of the standard. We'll talk more about the process requirements, but essentially the process requirements need to be included as are applicable to the R2 facility. So not all facilities will apply all of those process requirements, but all of the relevant process requirements must be applied and included in the certification based on what a given organization is doing. And that would be included in the R2 facility scope as well as in their certification. We will talk more about that later in the presentation. R2v3 contains a greater emphasis on reuse, and there are more prescriptive requirements in some of those areas related to data security, testing, and repair processes. As I mentioned, there is the clarification of any requirements that were not clearly understood or were not being effectively implemented, again, to maintain the intent of the standard while they were revising it. Another main change is the creation of a second document to be used in conjunction with the standard. This is the R2 Equipment Categorization Document, or the REC document, and we will talk about that at the end of the presentation as well. And you will see that referenced throughout the standard on a number of occasions. So going through section by section, the introduction section doesn't have any significant changes regarding the comprehensiveness of the standard, the need for all trade to be legal, applicability of the standard. The main change here would just be, again, the reference to the REC document. I've included a link where you can download a copy of that document as well. As I mentioned, it's to be used in conjunction with the standard. At a high level, this document provides an outline of the requirements for evaluating electronic equipment and components and categorizing them based on their condition, their functionality, their data sanitization status, things like that. We'll talk more about this, but either the categories identified in the REC need to be utilized exactly by the R2 facility or utilized via a cross-reference to link the categories spelled out in the REC with the categories already in use by the R2 facility. Again, towards the beginning of the standard, before we get into the core requirements, no significant changes to the R2 certification section in terms of the auditability of the documents. So the R2 Code of Practice is auditable, the R2 guidance document is not. The general auditing requirements haven't changed. And again, we don't have a timeline yet for the revised versions of the Code of Practice or R2 guidance document to be public. One change in this section worth noting is that the R2 V3 certificates, once issued, will look a little bit different. Not only will they list any applicable allowances as was already required by the Code of Practices, but now will also list the relevant process requirements. And that is the second half of the standard, the process requirements we mentioned earlier, found in the appendices. All of the applicable process requirements will be listed on the certificate for the R2 facility. Certainly take some time to look at the definitions section of the standard. We're not going to go through all of these, but there are some new and some changed or revised definitions here. There is a new term, brokering. The control definition within the standard is new. There's a revised data definition. Downstream vendors has been revised, slightly specific to suppliers. The evaluation stage category definition is new. Focus material definition has been revised. The key function definition has been removed. R2 facility is a term you'll see throughout the standard. Refurbishing and sanitization are also now defined within the standard. Okay, so now we're going to go through section by section in the core requirements portion of the standard. Core requirement 1 represents scope. And we're only going to focus on the significant changes here versus going through the whole standard. So under scope, all processes at the R2 facility, as well as any external processes and locations under the control of the R2 facility and associated with its certification, must be audited and certified to R2. So this has to include all of the core requirements, which is the first half of the standard, and any applicable process requirements given the facility's scope of operations. Services outside of the facility but still related to operation might include things like off-site collections, mobile data destruction, anything being performed at the customer's site that falls within the scope, things like that. A new requirement within this section as well is that R2 facilities will be required to publicly communicate a current list of all other locations not certified to R2 that are owned and operated by the R2 facility and used to manage electronic equipment. That list needs to be maintained current. Core requirement 2 contains the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. No significant changes here. Core requirement 3 contains requirements for the EHS management system. ISO 45001 will shortly be replacing OSAS 18001 2007, so both are referenced and are interchangeable at this time. This section requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances, which was not necessarily explicitly included in the verbiage in R2 2013. When we're talking about focus materials, we're thinking along the lines of mercury, lead, beryllium, cadmium, PCBs, phosphor compounds, flame retardants, silica dust, chlorinated or brominated dibenzodioxins, and dibenzofurans, as well as hexchrome. So this depends on the specific equipment materials that are being processed by the facility, what off of this list would apply or would potentially represent exposure risk to the facility. And then industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements are listed or required for high-risk activities such as materials recovery. We'll talk more about that when we get to that relevant appendix and process requirement. Core requirement 3 specifies minimum accommodations required for workers, safe drinking water, restroom facilities. This is an important one. Controls to prevent the consumption of food in areas which are not kept contaminant free. So this kind of goes back to the potential risk of some of these items given the materials processed at the facility. Other than that, the EHS requirements are very similar to R2 2013. Core requirement 4, legal and other requirements, requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations. It also requires that the R2 facility notify their certification body, like PJR, if they receive a notice of violation that requires action or follow-up within 30 days. So this is something that hasn't been required in the past. If your organization gets an NOV, a notice of violation for regulatory requirements, maybe you strayed outside of a permit requirement or threshold or something like that, you need to notify your CB within 30 days. Core requirement 4 prohibits child and forced labor. Prison labor is prohibited except in certain, if certain criteria are met, which include compensation for workers and the teaching of skills to be used upon release to gain employment. And also this section requires non-discrimination policies. Core requirement 5 covers tracking throughput requirements. This section addresses the need for summary reports for all transactions and what specifically the records need to contain, such as the accuracy of dates, detailed descriptions. We're not looking for blanks here in the forms. We're looking for everything to be filled out so that the audit trails and the records are found to be complete for all inbound and outbound equipment, components, materials. The summary report definition doesn't exist yet. It likely is addressing inbound and outbound quantities within a defined reporting period. Inventory levels need to be maintained below the limits of conformity to applicable legal requirements, the R2 facility closure plan, and any other limits that may be relevant to the facility. Equipment, components, and materials with a negative value cannot be stored for more than 1 year. The only exception to that would be components that have been evaluated and inventoried per Appendix C, which is the test and repair requirements. We will get to that later. Core requirement 6 addresses sorting, categorization, and processing. This section has really been restructured. It looks very different. There are a lot of references to the REC document where maybe terms are defined or criteria are expanded upon. The R2 facility is required to have a written process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing materials. And this section of the standard prescribes certain items that need to be included within those processes. Obviously, we are looking for conformance to the hierarchy, which is in core requirement 2, the application of the REC categories, instructions for determining reuse potential, and any follow-up actions required when an equipment changes categories. So take a closer look at that section to see how those changes may impact you. There's a lot of change in this section, as I mentioned. Any equipment or components inbound from a non-R2 supplier have to be treated as both non-functioning and data-bearing Again, this references the REC document. Additional changes include the fact that data evaluations need to include any connected user accounts. There are prescribed identification requirements for equipment or components that have been evaluated and found to be capable of reuse. And again, there are references to the relevant appendices in those areas. Equipment that is processed for a customer who directs the downstream disposition when the equipment is not owned by the R2 facility is handled under Appendix F, and we'll get to that one later. Specific requirements for electronics or components categorized as exempt equipment is also a new subject. These need to be handled separately from controlled equipment, and we will get to these definitions later. Identified as such, there needs to be a justification for exemption, things like that. These requirements are also spelled out within Core Requirement 6. There are also now specific requirements for transferring functioning requirements, such as packaging requirements, the use of unique identifiers for both sale and shipping records. Verification of shipment legality is not a new requirement, but it can be found now in Core Requirement 6. As I mentioned, controlled equipment is defined in the REC that can be found in Table 1. It includes any, and it means all, equipment or material received by the R2 facility that has not yet been evaluated for functionality or reuse potential, as well as items that have been evaluated and determined to either be destined for material recovery or test and repair. So upon evaluation, as I mentioned earlier, you may determine that some of it is actually exempt equipment, but until it's been evaluated, it falls under that controlled equipment definition. Physical labels are not necessarily required. There would be other acceptable methods for identification and tracking, such as barcodes. Core Requirement 7 brings us to data security requirements. The standard requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with specific procedures addressing the subjects prescribed within Core Requirement 7. So just a couple examples really briefly, the types of data storage devices accepted, what type of general information may not require sanitization, the potential for repopulation of data, applicable contractual requirements, if any applicable legal and other requirements, and relevant policies or procedures in place that relate to those requirements and ensure conformance. So how you're tying in the requirements to the actual process controls. There is a requirement for a written data security plan, which is separate from the data sanitization plan. Risk of theft and unauthorized access need to be considered within the security program. And the levels of security permissions for controlled access need to be implemented and relevant to the types of equipment received, the nature of the data on the equipment received, again, any relevant legal requirements, etc. And this is all to be authorized by the data protection manager. Continuing within Requirement 7, written acknowledgements are required for anyone granted security authorization, and these need to address their individual responsibility to prevent the release of data, the need to report theft or data breaches, and several other items specified within Core Requirement 7. It also requires an incident response procedure for the investigation of potential or actual breaches of data security and the notification of regulators, suppliers, interested parties, etc. as relevant. Contracts are required to be used when transporters are utilized for data-bearing equipment or components related to security controls. And There may be security controls required for transportation of data-bearing products, such as somehow concealing the package's contents, for utilizing a tamper-evident seal, something along those lines. Notifications to the supplier and record-keeping requirements are detailed as well. We're looking for evidence that the data-bearing equipment was received. Devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to an R2 certified downstream vendor with a written contract in accordance with Appendix B. I think I have a typo here. Hang on. So if the R2 facility is not conducting the data sanitization themselves, they can ship or transfer the data destruction, the data-bearing media to an R2 certified downstream vendor for those data destruction activities to be conducted, as long as everything is in accordance with Appendix B. But you'll note that that needs to be an R2 certified downstream vendor. There are also specified notifications to suppliers that are required upon a change in downstream vendor and when a security breach has been identified, whether it is only suspected or it's actually a confirmed security breach. And if you take a look at the definitions section, suppliers relate to upstream providers of electronics, maybe another R2 facility as well. In core requirement 8, we focus on the focus material subject. There are still requirements to demonstrate the recycling chain's expertise, capacity, methodologies, and capabilities related to the processing of focus materials that they'll be doing on behalf of the R2 facility. Alkaline batteries not containing mercury are not considered focus materials in R2v3. They would alternatively just be managed under core requirement 2, which is the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. And in R2v3, even lead-free circuit boards are considered focus materials. So we're not worried about the burden of proof that used to be required for the R2 facility to show the circuit boards were lead-free if that was the route that they were going. Core requirement 9 addresses various facility requirements, including indoor storage requirements, labeling requirements, insurance coverage requirements as relevant to the risk and scope for the R2 facility's operations. There is a requirement for specific information to be disclosed to SERI, including the closure plan, the financial instrument, and the insurance coverage. There are also now exceptions for the requirement to hold a financial instrument to cover the closure costs in the event of abandonment. And those are if the total closure costs are less than $10,000 US, the size of all buildings owned, leased, or used by the R2 facility equal less than 1,000 square meters, and the R2 facility never accepts equipment or materials containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. So this isn't a or list, this is an and list. You have to meet all 3 of these bullet points in order to be exempt from the requirement to hold a financial instrument to cover closure costs in the event of abandonment. Core requirement 10 covers transport. No significant changes here, obviously, or should be obvious, but the standard requires accurate codes, descriptions, and declarations for shipping documents and labels when transporting focus materials to maintain compliance with the standard as well as any applicable regulatory requirements. The core requirement 10 is the last core requirement, and then we move to the process requirement, which we can look at in more detail in future presentations, but I will go through them briefly. And these, again, are the appendices. These process requirements will be listed on the certificate as applicable to the facility. You can't exclude any that are applicable to you. You have to include all of the ones that are applicable to you. And then if it's not applicable, it just won't be listed on your certificate. Appendix A represents the downstream recycling chain requirements. So you find requirements related to the FM plan and due diligence criteria found in Appendix A, which continues to include the need to verify import and export legality for any transboundary shipments. The import-export compliance evidence needs to be in a language understood by both the recycler and the auditor. That is not a new requirement, but it is an ongoing issue, so it's worth reiterating. But something new and probably exciting to many certified clients is that the verification of a valid R2 certificate will satisfy the due diligence requirements. So one more time, a valid R2 certificate will satisfy due diligence requirements. I can hear everybody clapping through the muted lines of the webinar. So what this means, and we'll talk about this in more detail in future presentations, but it's not as simple as just checking that they have an R2 certificate. As in the past, the certificate needs to be valid, as in not expired, and current. You can check Ceres website, which they maintain for any changes to certification. If a client has been suspended or their certificate has been revoked or they've let it lapse, just because you have a copy of their certificate in your hand doesn't mean it's valid and in good standing. So it'll be the R2 facility's responsibility through their due diligence process to ensure that that certificate is valid, and also that the process requirements, once they transition to R2B3, these process requirements that we're going through, where you need to list all of the relevant ones, that should match or needs to match with the processing that they're saying they're doing for any focus materials that you are sending them. So making sure that the R2 certificate is valid and jives with your focus material plan, your downstream disposition expectations, all of that should match up. There are also requirements for transparent communication of the recycling chain, those downstream vendors, who your downstream vendors are, to suppliers and Ceres. I'm sure more information will be coming out about that as time goes on. Appendix B covers the data sanitization requirements. It lists the additional requirements beyond the contents of core requirement 7. There are traceability requirements, training and competency requirements, security controls. This section includes a physical destruction methods table. So take a look at that section in detail as well. It also requires that the data protection manager verify the outputs of physical destruction, logical sanitization, and prescribed quality controls. So we're not going into these appendices in great detail today. I'm just giving a high-level overview of what each appendix contains. So feel free to obtain a copy of the standard and start looking at the sections of process requirements that sound like they will be applicable to your facility. And in future webinars, we can discuss these in more detail. Appendix C covers the test and repair requirements. Any R2 facility certifying to this particular process requirement is going to be required to also maintain certification to a quality management system. This was not explicitly required in the previous version of the standard in R2 2013. It was one of the ways to meet requirements, but now it is required. So when we're talking about a quality management system, 2 examples would be ISO 9001 and RIOS. There may be others, but these would be the most common. This section requires an R2 reuse plan, a documented R2 reuse plan. and it includes prescribed criteria to include in this plan, such as documented instructions, competency requirements, safety checks, functionality testing plans, verification of effectiveness, return policy information, things like that. Materials need to be processed within 1 year of receipt. We mentioned that earlier. So that means tested, repaired, or refurbished within 1 year of receipt, or the evaluation of the components and inventorying those components for to serve as parts for repair processes in the future. So either they have to be fully processed through the testing, repair, or refurbishing side, or they have to be inventoried as repair parts within that 1 year requirement. The test result records need to be maintained for all functions and include unique identifiers for those items. Appendix D covers specialty electronics reuse. So for any R2 facility certifying to Appendix D process requirements, they also need to have Appendix C included in their certification. So you can't have Appendix D without also having Appendix C, which then also means you have that quality management system certification you're maintaining. Appendix D includes criteria and verifications required in lieu of testing those specialty electronics if the R2 facility lacks the technical capability to test specialty electronics. And you need to be able to demonstrate that the customer accepts those terms, such as that lack of testing, and this is spelled out really clearly in the Appendix D, and that the customer will only sell directly to an end user with a free lifetime return policy, so no cost to the end user, because again, it hasn't been tested. So there's specific requirements spelled out for specialty electronics. Take a close look at that section if that is going to be applicable to you as an R2 facility. Appendix E represents materials recovery. This section, when we're talking about materials recovery, we're talking about shredding focused materials. We're not talking about an enclosed small hard drive shredder, but shredding beyond that, breaking, cutting, melting, chemical processing, other things along those lines for the focused materials. So this appendix brings in additional EHS requirements if the R2 facility is performing materials recovery. So on top of the requirements of core requirement 3, you would have additional requirements in Appendix E if materials recovery is relevant to your facility. Appendix F is the service-only process requirement. It applies to scenarios where services are performed for a customer when the R2 facility does not own the equipment. The equipment is customer owned, and the customer dictates which downstream vendors are to be used. So this is when Appendix F would apply. And there are still requirements to include the downstream vendors in the downstream recycling chain and all the requirements of Appendix A. It's not an exclusion for that. You still have to do the downstream due diligence and maintain all the required records. There may be specified criteria for contracts as well found in Appendix F, and there's also a requirement to process equipment that falls into this category within 3 months of receipt. So if you are falling into this requirement of service only, that inbound equipment or materials needs to be processed and sent downstream within 3 months of receipt. The only exception to that would be if the contract you have with your customer includes not just the processing, but also warehousing or storage of those materials. That would be the only exception to that 3-month requirement. And we also still have that 1-year limit for storing equipment with a negative value that we mentioned earlier. That is still in place even in Appendix F. The last appendix for process requirements is brokering, and this applies to a scenario where the R2 facility never physically receives or processes the equipment. It sources the equipment and components, having them transported directly to a downstream vendor or end user. Again, the downstream vendors need to be included and managed according to Appendix A. You're not exempt from those requirements. And the R2 facility needs to, again, we have a requirement for a quality management system. So if you're applying this process requirement, you are required to maintain certification to either, for example, ISO 9001 or RIOS. If you are satisfying the requirements and applying Appendix G for brokering, this appendix would satisfy the requirements for insurance, closure cost, financial instrument, and those are found in Core Requirement 9. This appendix for brokering would also satisfy the requirements of the EHS criteria found in Core Requirement 3. So if you are not physically receiving or processing the materials, we are not looking at the EHS impact for your facility because there wouldn't be any. And we're not looking for evidence of a financial instrument and insurance covering, any issues that you might have resulting from processing those equipment because, again, you're not physically receiving it or doing anything with it. Okay. Really quick before we move on to the certification process overview and questions, at a high level, I want to mention the R2 equipment categorization document as well. And again, we can explore these in more detail in future webinars, but this document provides a framework for the evaluation and categorization of equipment throughout the standard. And there are categories for cosmetic condition, functional condition, the status of the data sanitization for each item. And these categories can be applied either individually for each item, product, electronic component, whatever we're talking about, or in batches. So if you are segregating certain sections of the facility or processing the loads in batches by category, you have some flexibility there. It's noted that CIRI would prefer the R2 facility use these exact categories spelled out in the REC, but again, it would also be acceptable to have a cross-reference in place, aligning your existing categories with the REC categories. Not all of these categories will apply to all R2 facilities. We would only be expecting you to use those that would be relevant to your organization. And these categories do not supersede any required descriptions related to contracts, regulatory requirements, or other requirements that you may be subject to. Additional categories beyond what's listed in the REC may be listed in the guidance document when that is published, but they would not be mandatory like the REC document is mandatory. Something to keep in mind. I have a screenshot of the table of contents of the REC document to give you an idea of how that is structured. The common equipment categorization tables, the first are those 4 tables listed on the right-hand side there. Equipment is assumed to be non-functioning unless testing demonstrates otherwise. I mentioned that earlier, I believe. Equipment found to be functioning is not subject to downstream due diligence requirements. That is not new. We're looking at the reuse requirements then versus treating it as a focus material going for recycling. Specific equipment categorization. This section is left blank right now. CIRI may adopt additional categories of this nature in the future. Appendix A provides enhanced cosmetic category information. These range from C0, which would be not yet categorized or evaluated, all the way through C9, which would be new but an open box, so relevant to the standard. Obviously, as with R2 2013, any new unopened items in the original packaging would not be within the scope of the R2 standard. Appendix B then links the functioning, cosmetic, and data sanitization categories for an overall categorization of those finished goods. Okay, so that is the new standard information based on the draft in a nutshell. For anyone who would be pursuing certification for the first time and isn't familiar with the registration process, I will go through that briefly and then we will address any questions that you guys may have. Excuse me. So the first step would be to download the standard. If you are going to be certified to R2v3, the draft is found at this link currently, or the current R2 2013, and all the other relevant documentation can be found at the second link in the R2 document library. When you are pursuing certification, you'll need to set up all of the EHSMS required documentation spelled out as required in the standard, conduct training to meet all applicable requirements, implement all applicable requirements, including conducting an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and a management review. Management review should take place after the internal audit so that the outputs of the internal audit can serve as an input for the management review. You would also need a contract with a certification body like PJR to conduct your audits. And you would then complete a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit. You would address any resulting nonconformities and a certificate would then be issued. The stage 1 audit is a documentation review and it serves to evaluate your readiness for the stage 2 audit. The stage 2 audit, on the other hand, is an audit of the entire management system, all of the processes, all the shifts, all the processes would be sampled. We'd really be covering everything, and any nonconformities issued from the stage 2 would need to be addressed through the corrective action process, accepted by your auditor, and closed out before a certificate could be issued. Once certified, your certificate is good for 3 years, except for the transition requirements we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. If you're still getting certified to R2 2013, it would typically be good for 3 years, and then you would be on a surveillance audit cycle for those next 2 years, whether annual or semi-annual, depending on your contract. And those audits, those surveillance audits, represent partial system audits. We wouldn't necessarily have to cover all of the shifts or all of the processes, so they would be shorter than your stage 2. That 3rd year would constitute the recertification audit, which is really exactly like the stage 2. We cover all of the processes, all of the shifts, and the audit, once any nonconformities are addressed, results in the issuance of a new certificate, and the 3-year cycle starts all over. I know I went through this all really fast. I wanted to get through the whole presentation in the allotted time. So if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and type your questions in. And while I answer any questions, I'm going to put our contact information up on the screen. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager. I can be reached by phone through PJR's main line, or my email address is listed on the screen. I also have the email address listed for our EHS Program Manager, Stacy DeSantis, and we can both be reached by phone as well. If you are a new client looking for a quote, I have also included our sales department phone number and contact information on the screen. Let's see what kind of questions we have. And I will do my best to answer them, but again, I want to reiterate that this is a draft version of the standard. So, okay, let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, so it looks like our first question is not for me, but for the other attendees here today, expressing concerns related to the draft version of the standard, the impact it may have on businesses who want to maintain R2 certification. This is not really the forum for a discussion like that. I'm not sure really how to facilitate understanding how many other companies in attendance of today's webinar would feel the same. That would be maybe a better discussion offline. Since the draft has been released and the formal final version of the standard hasn't been published yet, CIRI is still taking into consideration all of the public feedback that's been received. That's why we don't have a firm date to expect the publication of the standard. Certainly, any feedback you have would be welcomed by CIRI. The public comment period has closed. I hope you expressed some of that before that closed, but feel free to keep in touch with CIRI about the feedback that you do have, the impact on the potential impact on your business, any reservations you have, things like that. If it's something specific and technical that I may be able to help talk through with you, feel free to, I'll move this out of the way, feel free to reach out to me and we can talk more offline. I personally haven't received any specific feedback on the standard that would have gone to CIRI, but as it impacts our clients, again, for technical discussions, we're certainly available to talk through that. The next question would be, we're currently in the process of getting certified to R2 in February of 2020. Is there a benefit to wait and certify to R2 V3 instead of having to certify for a different R2 standard version so soon after getting certified for the first time? So if you get certified in February of 2020 to R2 2013, you will have your certificate, once issued, will reflect that expiration date of December 31st, 2022. So you would have until then to certify to or transition to R2 V3. That gives you, depending on how long it takes you to close out your February audit, any NCRs you may have been issued, and actually get that certificate in hand, that gives you more than 2 years still before you would be required to transition. So that's really up to you. If you want to potentially postpone your audit, it's possible that we could switch your February audit to the R2 V3. I can't say definitively though, because the fourth quarter 2019 expected publication date is only an estimate. If it comes out later, or they postpone our auditor training, or the accreditation process moves slowly, there are several factors. I can't say definitively that your February audit could be held to R2 V3. So you can certainly discuss that with PJR in more detail, the feasibility of switching your February audit to R2 V3. We can explore the possibility of postponing that registration audit to when we would definitely be ready to do the R2 V3 audit. Or like I said, you can move forward. I'm assuming you've already, if your audit is in February, you've already got some of your documentation and training underway. You could also, as I said, continue with your February audit to be certified to R2 2013 and then have about 2 years at least to transition to the R2 V3 standard. That's really a judgment call. Feel free to contact me and we could talk more about it offline as well. Okay, and then we have another comment. Oh, thank you, Roger. So just a note for anyone who has additional concerns about the standard, we have someone on the TAC here with us on the webinar today, and there will be an additional 45-day comment period after the the next draft is released. So any changes to this draft that we're talking about today, once released, there will be another comment period. So keep an eye on that opportunity as well. If you have feedback or concerns about the standard, there will be one more opportunity before the final version of the standard is released. I encourage you to utilize that opportunity to express the concerns or questions or feedback that you may have at that time before that comment period does close and the final version of the standard is released. Thank you, Roger. Okay, so that was it for our questions for today. Again, we will be updating this webinar and holding it again as more information becomes available, as we become more familiar with the draft version of the standard, and then certainly after the final version is published as well. So thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to discussing the R2V3 standard in more detail with you as time goes on. Have a great day.